Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity this morning to participate in the budget debate. It's been 8 years now that this Liberal government has been in office, and that is ample time for people to step back and take things into perspective. Imagine for a minute a typical Canadian family who is driving an 8-year-old car. Let's say they decide that it's time to buy a new car, so they head down to the local car dealership and walk through the showroom and maybe take a car for a test drive. What are some of the new features that they would notice in a 2023 car that weren't there in 2015? Well, for starters, the entertainment system has improved by leaps and bounds with features like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Parallel parking and fitting into tight spots has never been easier, with rear-view cameras, dash cameras, and even 360-degree bird's-eye view cameras. Gas-powered cars have never been more fuel efficient, and more options for electric or hybrid vehicles are showing up in showrooms every year. Safety features have improved immensely as well, with motion sensors to tell you if another car is in your blind spot or if you're following the car in front of you too closely. Madam Speaker, with all of these improvements in cars that we have seen over the last 8 years, I can't help but wonder if we have also seen any similar improvements in the federal government. What does the federal government do today that makes the average Canadian pause and say, wow, that's a big improvement from 8 years ago? Well, for starters, let's look at the passport office. I remember just a few years ago when I had to renew my passport, I was in and out of the passport office in maybe half an hour, and then my passport arrived in the mail in a couple of weeks. But Madam Speaker, the passport office over this past year has been a national embarrassment, with people camping out in front of passport offices for days, only to be turned away because their travel plans had not yet been finalized. Madam Speaker, to this day, my constituency office still gets phone calls and emails from people asking for advice about how to apply for a passport so they don't have to cancel their vacation plans or camp out in front of a passport office for days on end. How about Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, the IRCC? If someone wants to sponsor a friend or family member to come to Canada, that person needs a visitor's visa or a permanent residency card. It used to be a relatively simple process of filling out and rubber stamping a few forms. Now it takes many months or even years of waiting. Literally every day, my constituency office receives multiple phone calls and emails asking what is the problem with the IRCC? Why is my case past its processing time? Why won't they return my calls? And when will my loved one be able to come to Canada? Or how about inflation and the cost of living? It used to be that anyone with a full-time job could at least put food on the table without having to turn to the local food bank for help. But that's not the case in Canada anymore. With the carbon tax pushing the price of groceries higher and higher, more and more fully employed working families are turning to food banks for help. In my home province of Saskatchewan, food bank use was up 35% last year. How about openness and transparency? This Prime Minister once tweeted, "It's hard not to feel disappointed in your government when every day there is a new scandal." Today, this government has been found in violation of Ethics Commissioner rules on 5 separate occasions and counting. Although that will probably slow down a bit now that the sister-in-law of a Liberal cabinet minister has been appointed to be the new Ethics Commissioner. Has this government at least made our streets safer? Are dangerous criminals being kept behind bars, or are tougher penalties deterring these criminals? Sadly, the answer is no. Year after year since this Liberal government was elected, violent crime rates have gotten worse than the year before. It's no longer uncommon to hear of a fatal stabbing on public transit or in front of a downtown Starbucks in broad daylight. Madam Speaker, to continue our car shopping analogy, by any objective measure, this government has been a major downgrade compared to what Canadians had just 8 years ago. Unlike that Canadian family who is shopping for a new car and checking out all the new whistles and bells that didn't exist 8 years ago, Canadians are left wondering why this Liberal government can't perform the basic functions that governments should be able to do. How is it that Canadians traded in a safe, reliable, dependable vehicle for a lemon that is always breaking down? Well, Madam Speaker, I think it's fair to ask, if we are consistently getting so much less from this government, then are we at least getting what we paid for? Is the deterioration in government services the result of massive spending cuts and massive tax cuts? If one takes a closer look at the numbers, that is not the case at all. Indeed, this Liberal government continues to raise taxes higher and higher. The carbon tax was raised yet again to $65 per tonne and will continue to increase up to $130 a tonne by the end of the decade. The excise tax on beer, wine, and spirits was raised again by 2%. And as if that weren't enough, in this budget, the government has also decided to implement a global minimum corporate tax, a share buyback tax, and a tax on dividends held by financial institutions. Madam Speaker, in addition to not getting taxes under control, this government is not getting spending under control either. Total expenditures for this budget will be just under $500 billion. That compares to a budget of just under $300 billion only 8 years ago. This means that annual spending by the federal government has increased by nearly 2/3 over the past 8 years. When one looks at the details of where exactly these expenditure increases are coming from, the picture becomes much more troubling. This year, $44 billion, or almost 10% of the government spending, will go towards interest payments on the federal debt. In the past, the Liberals have said that the government's massive debt burden was nothing to worry about because of record low interest rates. Sadly, the days of record low interest rates are over, and Canadians are left paying the bill. What is also troubling is the ever-growing size of the federal civil service. During the last term of Stephen Harper's government, a consistent focus on efficiency was able to gradually reduce the size of the federal civil service by 25,000 employees. Since coming to power 8 years ago, this Liberal government has hired back more than triple that number. Perhaps if this government weren't so obsessed with regulating social media newsfeed algorithms, confiscating hunting rifles and shotguns from law-abiding firearms owners, restricting fertilizer use by farmers, or sending COVID checks to dead people, then maybe we would not need this small army of federal civil servants. Madam Speaker, while these times may be difficult, it's important to stay optimistic. To the 1.5 million Canadians who had to use the food bank last year, to the thousands of Canadians whose vacations were ruined because they couldn't get their passport renewed, and to the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are trying to sponsor a loved one to come to Canada, I say to you, don't lose hope. This latest Liberal budget shows that it's time to trade in this old, broken down, rusted out, clunker lemon of a Liberal government and trade it in for a shiny, new, reliable, dependable, conservative government that people can depend on. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank the member for his intervention today. Towards the end of his speech, he talked about the size of the public service and the individuals that work for the federal government to deliver the services that we provide to Canadians. I'm wondering, he talked with great pride about Stephen Harper's legacy of reducing the public service size. I'm curious if he could inform the House as to where he would think would be the best places to start eliminating jobs within the public service.
Member for Regina Wascana.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Yes, I would say Bill C-11 and this new government policy of regulating social media news feed algorithms. I think that is a very clear example of something that the government has no need to do and no business doing and doesn't need to even contemplate doing. I think that if we were not so focused on Bill C-11 and social media newsfeed algorithms, there would be a lot more federal civil servants who could focus on issuing passports and doing the things that government should be doing. I would also add the confiscating and buyback of hunting rifles and shotguns. I would also add the fertilizer restrictions on farmers as well. Lots of things that the government does that it doesn't really need to do.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Repentigny.
The honourable member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. Now, he's been criticizing government expenses and spending. There is one we've criticized, and I'd like to hear from him. The billions of dollars that are being spent on hydrogen and carbon capture. Regarding carbon capture, many projects in the world have been abandoned, and the U.S. is canceling incentives for this. So why not try to cut that out of the Liberal budget?
For Regina Wascana.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm of the view that the natural resource sector is best left to provincial governments. The Constitution in this country is very clear under sections 91 and 92 that natural resources are the jurisdiction of the provincial government. And I know in my home province of Saskatchewan, the natural resource sector is actually a major generator of revenue for the provincial governments. It seems like a good idea, and it would make sense to me if the provincial governments in this country were allowed to take the lead on managing their resource sectors, and the federal government can help best by staying out of the way.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Avalon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to go back to a question from my colleague from Kingston and the Islands, because he really didn't get an answer on the question. The question was, I believe, as I heard it, which department in the civil service would you cut jobs and fire people for? Through the Speaker.
For Regina Wascana.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I believe I answered the question adequately. Bill C-11 and the regulation of social media newsfeed algorithms. Yes, I see the member for Kingston and the Islands is chiming in. And I would also add the fertilizer restrictions on farmers that the government announced a couple of years ago. Totally unnecessary. No need for a single civil servant to spend 1 minute on any of that, and as well as the confiscation of firearms from law-abiding firearms owners and the money that the government would have to spend to buy them back. All of that is totally unnecessary, and those are things that the government doesn't need to be doing.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Courtney Alberni.
Madam Speaker, first I want to thank my colleague for his speech. I just came back from the Association of Vancouver Island Municipalities, where we heard from municipal governments, especially mayors and councillors that were in attendance, about their concerns about the federal government not supplying municipalities with adequate funds to cover the new increase in RCMP policing, which I think we all agree in this place, Madam Speaker, that RCMP officers have been highly underpaid. We're glad to see them unionized. But through you, Madam Speaker, to my colleague, does he agree that the federal government should have provided the top-up to local governments instead of downloading on them, where they only collect about 8% of the overall taxes in this country? Thank you.
Member for Regina Wascana.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I do think we need to support our law enforcement officials. That includes the RCMP. And I would also add that, as we've seen with the Mass Casualty Commission's report as a result of the Nova Scotia shootings, we do need to improve police training in this country and RCMP training in this country. And I would also add that the RCMP depot in Regina is the best place to do that. I think that the proposal in the Mass Casualty Commission's report to shut down depot in Regina is misguided, and we should be proud of our RCMP officers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Prise du débat. Resuming debate, l'honorable député de Laval-les-Îles.